are 19 million war veterans living in the United States today. 19 million men and women who've lived extraordinary lives. 19 million stories worth telling. Stories about big wars and small gestures. These are the Americans who witnessed history. These are the wars as seen through their eyes. These are the stories of veterans from World War I, World War II, and the Korean, Vietnam, and Persian Gulf Wars. Each day, we lose 1,500 of those who served, and we lose more of our history as their stories go untold.
Recording those stories is a part of America's history. The entire story will come together when you tell your part of it.
Millions of Americans. Millions of stories. Tell your story. Ask others theirs. There's no story or sacrifice too small.
I urge all Americans, veterans and non-veterans alike, to participate in this very, very important project. Veterans help to shape our nation's future. And only by understanding what they did for us can we truly understand the price of freedom.
Hello, my name is Frank Boring. I am the Director of Oral History at the Michigan Military Preservation Society. We are a nonprofit organization that's building the Michigan Military Air, Land, and Sea Museum at the Gerald R. Ford International Airport. What you've just seen is an excerpt from a promotional film that was put out by the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project is an attempt to gather material, oral histories, documents, diaries, letters from all over the country of our veterans. Here at the Michigan Military Museum, we are a partner archive with the Library of Congress. What this means is that all the materials that we gather stay here in Michigan. We identify them, we put them into a database, and we will make them available to future generations to access through our website. What you're about to see is a raw, uncut oral history interview. At some later date, we will actually edit these and make them available through the schools. At this point, you will have an opportunity to see what it's like to have an actual oral history interview. These will be going on each week with a different veteran. We hope you enjoy. Ralph, I just want to begin by saying I'm Frank Boring from the Michigan Military Museum. For the record, say your name, please.
Ralph Hauenstein.
Okay. Ralph, we had discussed earlier that you wanted to start with the period of time in which you were the city editor. I wonder if we could start at that point, please.
Well, I mentioned that because it was the beginning of the time that, as city editor, I received a notification from the War Department that I was being called into service. I was a reserve officer at the time, and this was in September of 1940, ordering me into service. It was at a time, of course, that they had passed the selective service law, and they were drafting these young men for a one-year period of time in October. And I then was called into service and sent down to Fort Sheridan, which was really the beginning of me as becoming an intelligence officer, so to speak. In those days, the Army was really not very adept at intelligence per se. I think the whole War Department in itself in Washington had a staff of less than 100, including civilians, enlisted personnel, and officer personnel. I was sent down to Fort Sheridan and immediately the commanding officer of Fort Sheridan needed a public relations officer, and having been city editor of a newspaper and having been on reporter staff and so forth, he appointed me as the public relations officer.
What was your rank?
I was a first lieutenant. And in those days, public relations and intelligence were the same thing, under the same command in Washington and throughout the chain of command. The officer who was the intelligence officer of Fort Sheridan had been drafted as, I think it had been an FBI officer, but he was only a second lieutenant. I was a first lieutenant, so that made me, as typical in the military, as the intelligence officer. I told him, you do your intelligence work and I'll do the public relations work. But ultimately, all the documents and so forth and other things were coming from Washington to the intelligence officer with my name on it. And fortunately, of course, for the intelligence officer, he was called back into the FBI because they took them out of the military and put them back at the request of J. Edgar Hoover. So I found my, pardon me.
What were the duties of a public relations officer?
Well, interesting you'd ask that question. The officer in command of Fort Sheridan was a colonel by the name of John Homer. Now, Colonel Homer had been a friend and a working companion of George Marshall. They'd worked together in Chicago on the staff, and Homer, was highly thought of by Marshall, as a matter of fact. But Homer could not be promoted to a brigadier general. His name had been put in to be a general, but they had had a fire, and it had burned the garage at Fort Sheridan, so that immediately holds up the promotions because he's a responsible officer. And it was my job to try to make things look a little bit better all the way around for Fort Sheridan. Fortunately, I suggested that we call in the FBI and investigate this fire because they hadn't been able to solve who did it or why. And within a short period of time, we did find that one of the soldiers was trying to siphon gasoline from one of the trucks and was smoking a cigarette at the time. And we solved the problem of the fire, and shortly thereafter he became the brigadier general, the staff he had. So he had a very close relationship with me in other areas that we were working in public relations with the Great Lakes Naval Station and so forth in Chicago. And they did in Chicago, they had at that time, the civilians down there formed a businessman's kind of an intelligence committee for themselves. At least they thought they were intelligence, but then I would be kind of a liaison and that sort of thing with them at the time.
Now, did you have a staff? Give us an idea of kind of the environment you were working in.
My staff consisted of 2 people. They had what I considered a very insidious thing with the military intelligence at the time, and that's what they called a CS system, a counter-subversive system. The concept was a carryover from World War I, wherein they would take enlisted personnel from the various groups and various echelons of command, particularly down to company and platoon level, and they would select one person who would be responsible for reporting back to me, intelligence, if any subversive talk or subversive acts or any subversive, in other words, have a cleansing, so to speak. I thought it was a very insidious thing, and ultimately I might say that it was eliminated eventually when I was up in Iceland. But that was one of my jobs as a intelligence officer.
Now, this is September of 1940, that period, so the war has not officially started, yet things are happening in Europe, things are happening in Asia. As the public relations officer, was there any relation to the things that you were doing that were the war, or just involving the fort that you were at?
Just local war, nothing. Well, for instance, they had a very secret radar equipment. It was called SCR-268 equipment, which were radar finding machines, and we were a anti-aircraft brigade at Fort Sheridan, and they sent the first units up to us, and of course some of them started falling off the wheels and so forth, and we thought it was sabotage. Well, that would be into my area, of course. Ultimately found out it was just poor ball bearings that they put on the wheels, but it was that sort of thing we did have to investigate. And I did find myself becoming involved in intelligence work.
Okay.
And now what the extenuation of that is that General Homer had called to Washington by Marshall in the summer of 1941, and he was told that apparently we would be getting into this war, and that we would form a unit to go up to Iceland to relieve the British and take over and work first with the British, but ultimately relieve the British. Now, Iceland was in the zone of combat. The Germans had a plan, and it was known to us for the invasion of Iceland. And so we went up there to be in brigade strength to start with. But it so happened that the selective service was so inculcated throughout the branches of the military that we could not really get together that number of troops, but what they were, these selective servicemen who were to be discharged after 1 year in October. So it was decided, then they sent up a Marine brigade until we could get enough officers and enough enlisted personnel of our own.
For people who, you know, Iceland is a very isolated place, and I think within the realm of history, this is something that's not very well known. First of all, Iceland is it's a country of peoples. What were the British doing there, and why was this important to us?
Because if you were to look at the map, you would see that if the Germans took Iceland, they could go from Norway to Iceland on down to France, which they occupied, and they would shut off the British entirely from convoys, and it would just be a catastrophe for the British. Also for the Russians, because we were sending lots of equipment to Russia. And it was a very, very pivotal point, naval-wise. So the point was that we'd be up there to protect the island.
Okay.
The British were up there in strength. The British were in strength in division form. As a matter of fact, I think it was the division that left Dunkirk that ultimately reformed and went up to Iceland.
Wow.
A very fine and well-trained division of British troops.
Now, you had mentioned that you were a public relations officer, and then the intelligence officer was actually transferred out. So you took over then as the official intelligence officer, even though your name was already on the documents.
Well, when Homer was to take this expedition to go over, ultimately, of course, he couldn't do it because we had to have a higher ranking officer by this time because of circumstances. So they chose General Bonesteel, who was a major general. But Homer wanted me, and he was to be the chief of staff, he wanted me on his staff. And as I say, remember now, public relations and intelligence were the same organization. So I found myself up in Iceland, went over with them. We went over there in September. We organized in August, but went up in September of 1941 before the war. And I did some public relations, but I found myself also doing intelligence work. And I ultimately ended up as the G2 assistant intelligence officer for the regular Army men.
You had mentioned earlier that there's a pretty much a common understanding that there was going to be a war. So you were in the thick of it. Were you convinced America was going to go to war?
Oh, I was certain of it, yes. I was absolutely convinced of it. Absolutely. Okay. I didn't know that it would start in Japan, but I certainly, and I don't think many people did. I thought that we would probably come over to Europe for sure. And I think, as a matter of fact, while we were in Iceland, we hadn't been up there, I don't think, more than less than a month. And the Germans, I think, tried to give us a test. And not far off the coast of Iceland, they torpedoed one of our destroyers. We're not in war yet. And it was USS Kearney. And they torpedoed that destroyer. As a matter of fact, I had to go out and see the destroyer, what was left of it, and I took in order not to be in a northern boat to be in jeopardy of being sunk also, I took a nice landing ship out there and a tugboat from Iceland, and saw and made the report of that sinking, or not sinking, but the destruction of it.
Was this covered in the newspapers? I mean, was this something?
Well, it was our instinct. We were very nervous about it at the time, coming back into Iceland, because in Iceland at that time, all the newspaper people were centered in Iceland. We had Drew Middleton, who was AP, but ultimately the New York Times military expert. We had Phil Alt from the UP, and we had all the people were up there from Iceland, and we tried to keep it quiet so they wouldn't know it, because we put it back to Washington. This was a good excuse for going to war if you ever wanted one. Everybody said Roosevelt wants to get us in the war. Well, he had his chance. So we put it back to Washington, kept it very quiet, that we wouldn't let anything get out from Iceland. And ultimately, Roosevelt handled it in a way, apparently politically and diplomatically, at least not to go to war, but made a big fuss about it.
That's just fascinating. So when you arrive in Iceland, try and give us an idea of what was the where were you staying? I mean, Iceland is, you think of as this ice area, but did you have a building that you stayed in? Were you billeted somewheres? I mean, where?
Nissen huts. We took up with us a lot of Nissen huts. The British made some available to us, and who were already, as I say, they were already there, and they made a great deal available to us. But we did a lot for the country of Iceland. We built their roads, and we built telephone poles by miles and miles, and did a great deal up there ourselves, you know. After all, Iceland was a little country at that time of only 125,000 people. It's a whole country, and it really didn't have anything to offer, you know. One of the things that was rather devastating to us in a way was the fact that the Navy had sent ships with us, with the meats and frozen other articles in one of the ships, who apparently were sailing under sealed orders that D plus arrival date so-and-so, they would just go back. Well, we weren't yet equipped ashore to take all the equipment, and of course we look out one day and our food ship went back, you know. So we lived on what is known as spam for a good long, that's where the word came in, from spam, you know. We lived on spam for months, you know. It's just a little sidelight of the war.
So give us an idea of the environment there. Did you have an office? Did you have a staff there in Iceland?
Yes, we had
phones
a staff. Oh yes, well, no, just a staff. A Nissen hut is where we lived in. And indeed, we had good staff. General Bonesteel was one of the well-known generals of the military. His father was a West Point man. He was a West Point man, and his son was a West Point man. So it's an old army. Believe me, old army. As a matter of fact, the special and general staff, I think, was 21 officers, and only 2 of us were either reserve. The rest were all regular army.
Okay.
I mean,
so when it was in Iceland then that I imagine that you heard the news of the war starting, Pearl Harbor.
yes.
And what was your reaction to that?
Well, if I don't misuse the word properly, but I was rather blasé about it because I thought surely it was going to come, the war, but I didn't know what was going to happen over there. But we knew we would be in a war eventually.
Well, you had mentioned earlier that you personally thought that it probably would be in Europe. And was most of the strategy that you were seeing in terms of intelligence geared towards Europe? Did you, in a sense, ignore the stuff that was going on in Japan?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So now it's Japan. I mean, I imagine you must have been scrambling or something. Can you give us an idea of what was going on within the community that you were working in? That now that it's not going to be in Europe, it's going to be in Japan. What happened?
Well, we were concerned, of course, because there was a tripartite. It was Italy, Germany, and Japan, and we were cautioned that there might be an attack on us. So we doubled our guard. We were concerned, of course, as to what the Navy might be able to send to us if we needed help up there. But we could count on the British because the British were nearby, and the Germans had a couple of good battleships around there, so we were very nervous about it. They were not that far away. We are on alert, very, very careful. Constantly.
Well, how did your job change now that the war had started?
Well, it changed quite considerably to the extent that the Germans were now sending over quite a few Focke-Wulf bombers. Not to bomb us, but they did one time bomb me, but reconnaissance. And ultimately we shot them down. And fortunately, one of the planes they shot down just shortly after we were there was a recon plane that had been doing liaison work with the submarines so that the codes of the Germans with warfare and the Navy, I took command of the group that went up and to see whether or not when the plane was shot down it was up in the glaciers. And I found out the crew was all dead. I didn't know that at the time, but they were dead. Unfortunately, they were dead when we got up there. And I got the code book, which was in good shape. And it was a very important book because by the time I could get back to base, I realized what we had and immediately commanded a B-17 and flew me down to London so that we could give it to the British and all the rest of our people also. And it was a very important, it turned out to be a very important thing as to breaking the codes and helping submarines.
This may seem a very stupid question, but you arrive in England with this code book. I mean, what was the reaction of the people? I mean, they must have realized how important this was.
Well, they did. They did. Yeah, very much so.
So you handed it over to somebody, and then you didn't know anything further beyond that, or how did?
No, I didn't. I didn't have much to do. Just conferred with what few people, the few Americans were in London at the time, at their staff, and came back to Iceland. Of course, then we carried on a great deal of anti-submarine war type of things out of Iceland and so forth. And the convoys were very important for going to Russia, as you well know. It was a tragic thing to see these convoys come up there maybe with 50 ships to go to Russia and come on back. Maybe there'd be 7 or 8 of them left. The rest were shot down either by the Germans off Narvik in the Norway or submarine warfare. But then I was called back into, by this time they were taking officers back. By this time I was the intelligence officer of the command, because the first officer had been sent back to America, and I was the intelligence officer of the Iceland-based command. Then, what do you want?
Oh, I was just going to say, what were your duties in that regard now? I mean, you're in a sense promoted, is that correct?
Well, promoted by ranks, yeah. Okay. I was already promoted by ranks several times, as a matter of fact. But
well, what were your duties now that you were in command of this?
Well, my duties were of course, liaison with Washington, and liaison with the British, and liaison with London, and to just keep alert of all, and to get knowledge, of course, of everything that was going on in our command and the potential of what the Germans were doing nearby. We did constant recon work out of Iceland into Norway, where the Germans had a lot of troops, you know, in Norway, and a lot of navy over there.
By recon, are you talking about by the air, or was there other?
Air.
Okay.
Well, we ran some intelligence work out of there because I can't remember, I think it was a brigade of Norwegians, the last survivors out of Norway came, and they were with us in Iceland. So we used them to send them back under espionage work, and we would get a lot of information out of there. Then, of course, in Iceland, we had a couple of, ultimately there were 2 agents of the Germans who were captured. We captured them, and they later became known as Beetle and Cobweb, was their names. But they were turned, and they became important, that I can discuss that later, to the invasion of Overlord. Then go ahead. I was, then in the summer of 1943, I expected to be sent back to America, as most all the officers were being sent back. But then arrived a general from the general headquarters out of Washington to see me. And he said, "Hauenstein, I'm sorry, we have to cancel you going back to America. And you have to go down to London for preparatory for a special mission." And I said, "Well, what's the mission?" He said, "Well, we're going to, this fall, we're going to invade from London into the Brittany, and we want you to be an intelligence of that command, that task force. Then on D plus a certain number of days, there will be a task force coming from America under the underbelly of France, and it will come through that way. We'll fly you out, and we'll meet the task force and come in the second invasion." I wasn't very happy about thinking going 2 invasions after being 2 years in Iceland. But I went down to London. I reported into the head man down there. He said, "Oh, Hauenstein, you've been for 2 years up in ice." He said, "For heaven's sake, take off some days and get yourself cleaned out here in London. Enjoy yourself." I said, "Well, okay." But it wasn't easy to enjoy yourself, you know. I saw a few plays and so forth. Then I went back to the headquarters at 20 Grosvenor Square in London, which is our headquarters. And I started wanting to give me indoctrinating. What do I have to do? Where is this? What do I go on? And paperwork I was getting didn't make any sense at all, you know. Then of course, I had to be informed of it. It was a, I think Project Wadham was the name of it, but it was a reply to Stalin, who said that he wanted us to invade so they took troops away from Russia. And something had to be done to withdraw troops out of Russia. Well, it was what do you call a phantom project. It wasn't going to be. We didn't have the troops to do it. And later on, von Rundstedt knew we didn't have. He told us so. We didn't have the troops to invade at all. So we couldn't possibly invade it. It was just one of these things where we used all the intelligence efforts, mostly through agents and so forth, to try to convince them that we were going to do that so they would withdraw the troops. But they didn't withdraw any troops, and the project was, of course, not so. Of course, that was a great relief to me. At the time, I was quite happy to learn about it. But
Just briefly, during your time when you actually had a little R&R in London, I assume you weren't eating Spam, right?
no, no. Well, of course, the poor British, it seems to me, were eating Brussels sprouts mostly in Great Britain at that time. They were pretty hard rations also at the time, you know.
Yep.
Yeah.
So your role then in London, if you could describe, you know, as you have described your other duties before in Iceland and whatnot, what were your duties now in London?
I was made assistant to the chief of the intelligence branch, Colonel Fouché, who was chief of the branch, was a World War I old regular Army officer, and a very fine officer. And I worked with him, and we worked on many projects. Of course, we were getting preparatory for Overlord. And one of the big problems was that we were getting a lot of officers over there from America who's just graduated from the Army Command and General Staff College, and try to put them into areas. You see, we never in the military before had what was known as great Army groups. We had armies, like Pershing was an army, Washington and so forth. Now we have Army groups, armies to form groups. We never had such a thing before. And this meant Army groups, armies, corps, divisions who needed translators, interpreters, all kinds of intelligence officers, so that we had to prepare a group to see that this would be taken care of from an intelligence point of view. And we got involved in that heavily. And then we also got involved, of course, at the time I was working with G3, G2, which means it was operations and intelligence. To that end, we had to play our part in what was going to be commonly known as Overlord. But it wasn't, at that time, it was not SHAEF, it was known as Cossacks, which was the commanding officer, Strategic Allied Command by a General Frederick Morgan, the British. Now remember, the intelligence of this war really was British. The British had been preparing for this for a long time. They'd been playing intelligence for centuries, as we had not played intelligence for centuries. And they had a great concept of what they were going to do or how to do it. It resulted, of course, from Churchill making that wonderful statement in which he said that truth in wartime is far too precious not to be protected by a bodyguard of lies. Therein came about the deceptions that we had to, because the war in Europe, at least for the invasion of Europe and France, could never succeed without two things, and that is, of course, the men who fought, Navy, Army, Air Corps, the rest of them. This was the number one. The second thing was that they would not have been successful had it not been for the intelligence deceptive efforts that we put on in the war. And to that end, we made our contributions also with the British. It was to be Project Bodyguard, from taking Churchill's word. And Bodyguard, of course, came off into two areas, went into what we call Fortitude for the northern part of it, and Zeppelin for the southern part, Balkans and so forth.
Give us an idea of the makeup of the staff. Was this largely British, largely American?
Well, we liaisoned with the British, but we were American, pure American. We had at the time, all the Americans at that time were we didn't consider ourselves part of the Cossack because that was pure British. We had a TAUSA, a European headquarters of operations, which was the TAUSA, TAUSA, European Theater of Operations, United States Army. General Devers was in command. Eisenhower was down in Africa, and Devers was in command at the time. He succeeded, I didn't get to that, did I? The general that was killed up in Iceland.
No, you didn't. So,
General, I should tell about Iceland. One of the things in Iceland, Devers succeeded General Frank Andrews. Frank Andrews was a commanding general in Europe at the time, and he decided that he wanted also, this was pretty much early summer, I guess it was at the time, to come up and visit Iceland, and he was killed. His plane was smashed into the mountains up there, and then General Devers took over as commanding general. So that the British had now remember, the British had been working on a plan for a long time. They had what was known as the Body of 12, a group of 12 who did the overall pretty deceptive concepts. Then within their body was a group of 5 who I don't think to this day anybody's ever known who they were particularly. But they came forward with these plans. They were submitted to us, looked over, but there was a lot of chinks in them at the time, particularly logistical factors. They were going to have all these troops go in and so forth, and we didn't have anywhere near the barges to put them in with. There was no way to get them in there. So that was, I just that as one example. And one of our men, a Major Ingersoll, at the time, Ingersoll had been an editor of a New York newspaper, commissioned. He was a very, very smart chap. And he went back to Washington and got with Harry Hopkins and the president and finally we got the barges, but it was quite a story within itself, is to take them away from the Pacific we wanted for us related.
Well, I was just thinking, you know, you're having a group of American officers, the British are directing, trying to direct the deception, so you're in a sense of filter. They're saying we would like to do this, and you're saying, well, we can't do it. There's not enough barges to do this. Well,
we had to get together so that we could make sense out of the whole thing, you know. For instance, the big deceptions really had to do with the Germans, of course, had about 200 divisions over there in Russia working. They had about 14 or 16 in the Balkans and 14 in Italy. They had 12 in Norway, and they had 56 in France and the Low Countries. Now, there was no way that we could possibly invade into France at all with what we were going to have, unless we could be sure, because the 19th Army in the Pas de Calais area was the area by which the Germans were convinced, and we wanted to make them more convinced it would be, because this is where the great bulk of the military striking force was, with about 2,000 big German tanks. No matter what we invaded, if those tanks got loose, it's off the whole deal. So the scheme was to set up deceptive means by which they would stay right there for invasion. Among them were many little nuances that were played.
Let me ask you something that may seem like a stupid question, but who were you trying to deceive? I know the Germans, obviously, that's a big, but who were you trying to deceive?
Trying to deceive the high command, Hitler particularly. And Hitler, of course, Hitler was our favorite target, and we deceived him completely. Fortunately, we could find through what we've known as now, it's released because it hadn't been released for years and years, what was known as Ultra. That was the big secret of the war. And we had Ultras that we knew very well, really, but virtually everything that the Germans were going to do, when they were going to do it and so forth. One of our best contacts was he was a very good friend, Hitler, and the ambassador to Germany from Japan were very good friends. And this ambassador, of course, would cable over to Tokyo, and then we'd pick it up and know he'd meet with Hitler and tell what happened to Hitler, so we'd get the story that way, you see.
I would imagine part of the deception is understanding or trying to understand the personality or the thinking of the high command of Germany and of Hitler. Was there a sense within your organization that you were dealing with a madman, or were you realizing this guy's a brilliant strategist? I mean, how are you dealing with trying to maneuver Hitler and maneuver the high command?
Well, he's an enemy, and you never underestimate an enemy, whether it's an individual or what it is. And so we never underestimated him because he had control. There was no question. For instance, prior to the invasion, just some weeks before the invasion, Rommel and von Rundstedt, who were commanding over there, pleaded with him to be sure to release some of those men, that 19th Army, and he would not allow it to be released. As a matter of fact, there were these divisions up here in Denmark and in Norway, and there were a lot of them, 12 of them, and he would not allow any of those divisions to be released. It was 9 days after the invasion. We were already ashore with hundreds of thousands of troops. It was 9 days later before Hitler decided one division could come out of Norway into there. That was all. So we kept them there all the time. It was an incredible feat, really, and absolutely. But we did that because they thought surely we were going to, we through phantom armies and some regular armies, or divisions I should say, they thought that we were going to really invade Norway. He was very, very, very scared about of us invading Norway. But they had set up so many deceptive plans. For instance, we got the Russians to work with us on deception plans that they would go through Sweden, and we even got the Swedish to talk a little bit about the fact that we might be hooking up with the Russians someplace and working together, which is what we're going to do at all. And it was frightening. But we, through an agent known as, well, of course we sent this message, but the number one agent was an agent by the name of Garbo, and who was a marvelous double agent who could feed this information, particularly on this phony division or devoted army that we set up in the southeast part of Great Britain.
Could you talk more about that? Because that's a fascinating part. This whole phantom army is just amazing.
Well, the idea was to set up an army to be commanded by Patton, who was going to invade into the Pas de Calais area, and every type of elements that you can think about to make it that way. That about, as I recall, I think it was 20 acres of land was set aside, and in there they put in dummies, dummy tanks. They really were rubber tanks and rubber trucks and phony people standing around, and move them around, and enough to make it look like it was a real army in there. And Patton was to head it up. Then the agents, Garbo, who was the chief double agent, who the Germans liked very much and who they thought so highly of it, they awarded him an Iron Cross at the time as a double agent, would cable back that he just now had recruited a waitress to work in there, for instance. She would, he'd get the information waitress, and then he had truck drivers who would do it, and then he had other people who would give that type of information back. Then, of course, Patton, who was supposed to head the army, we managed to have him give talk to some societies and different people, and have printed the papers so that he could copy from the papers, and he was here with his army and so forth, showing him being at the locations. He didn't like that very much. Then we wouldn't let him fly more than, if Germans came over with their reconnaissance planes, we'd let them fly at about 30,000 feet, because we knew at 30,000 feet they couldn't tell exactly where. But below that, shot down. And other things. I mean, I can't go into all the things because there were so many. But I might add about the phony army that we were going to invade into Norway. We used the Germans. We told them we were going to have divisions from Scotland, some Canadians, some Norwegians, and a 55th division from Iceland, which was absolutely, there was no division in Iceland whatsoever. But we used our old Cobweb and Beetle, our good old agents from Iceland. We could use them to convince the Germans that we were that 55th division. They were in Iceland. See? This sort of thing went on in the war. That's about the way. Okay.
Now, the strategy then for the invasion at Normandy D-Day. You've set up these deceptions. You have all these different elements going on, including one of the most brilliant ones I've ever read of is and I know you weren't directly involved in it, but you knew about it, the soldier that had the papers on him and he's floating around.
No, that was purely a British operation. It was remember, the British really were behind virtually all of this. Their ideas and schemes, and we had to supplement and assist and do all kinds of make it workable. But no, that was a pure British operation. There were a lot of these sort of things that went on that I can't even remember them all.
Right.
Remember, you're trying to force me to go back 60 years, you know, and I'm no kid anymore. I remember all these things.
Well, your memory is quite remarkable. So now the deceptions are in place. The date is set, I would imagine, for the invasion. What was you personally, what was your biggest concern on the eve of D-Day?
Well, of course, everybody was concerned. Was it going to succeed or wasn't it? You know, we didn't know. I know that we had before, back in late '43, we had Lord Mountbatten had a special school, called a school. It wasn't a school, it was kind of a course, a training course. They brought in officers from all over, the intelligence officers from all over Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, the United States, and England. And in Mountbatten, there were 2 Americans, and the idea of that was to get the viewpoints of what could be done, what should be, what could be and could not be done. I remember one of the things they talked about was the fact that they didn't want to put battleships in the channel. And I said, we need that artillery. You got to have 16-inch guns in there. But they said, it's dynamite, because coastal guns of France and the Arab War, they just sink those ships, you know. But we did finally. We got the battle. But it was Lord Mountbatten's school. It was a very, very interesting, highly productive course, because we had the leaders who'd fought in the Battle of Britain, you know. We were planning only so many flights per day for the pilots, bombers, so many for the fighters and so forth. And he laughed at it and said, you didn't seem to care about that when you fight in the Battle of Britain, you know. And he went on about how many had. These sort of things went on. It was a marvelous course. And Lord Mountbatten had it. And then he assembly was held up in Larg, Scotland. And they had partly, I suppose, up there because the cliffs in that place were very much assimilated to what we were doing. So we watched the British Marines simulate what we were going to do on invasions, and sometimes using live ammunition.
Give us an idea of the preparation from your perspective. I mean, I know you were in an office, you were maybe actually viewing, but what was involved in the preparation for the invasion of D-Day? Logistically, I mean, what was involved in
Well, logistically, you mean the supply? The supply?
Yeah, I guess the overall picture from your vantage point. I mean, we know that the infantry was here, and there's going to be paratroopers and all that. I mean,
well, everything in the military, you have your operations. Your G3 plans, your full operations, intelligence, you feed what makes things feasible, what may not make it feasible. From the supply point of view, the logistical point of view was commanded by Major General C.H. Lee, who the one written about him later in the war was the fact that he put his people into Paris, but he withdrew them eventually. But it was his job, and I think he really did a magnificent job to be able to logistically get the troops. And one of the things, of course, I think the big thing was that the Germans expected us. As a matter of fact, Hitler had told 2 days before the invasion the Japanese men that we were going to invade with 87 divisions on the ground and 7 airborne divisions. At no time did we have more than 37 divisions in the whole thing, plus 5 airborne divisions. That's all we ever had. But he was convinced we were going with all that. But just the fact of supply of this, with the ammunition, yes, the only time that a real chink really kind of came up was when Patton went so fast that we had to stop just beyond Paris, around that area. We got beyond Paris a little bit. But he had to stop because the gasoline ran out. But I think it ran out for a lot of other factors. The lines of communication were very long. It was hard to bring in the supplies. And I don't think the French were helping us very much by finding gasoline along the way, frankly.
So D-Day, as I understand it, because the weather was delayed a day, then it actually happens. What were you doing on D-Day?
Well, I was in the war room. That's all. Watching the war room was all. Watching it. Nothing I could do. It's all over as far as I'm concerned. Either yes or no.
What was the mood in the war room?
Somber. So. Everything went pretty much according to plans, excepting one division, a German, I don't remember the number of the division, but it was a German division, and the general, at that time, he was in reserve. He was a reserve divisional commander. He decided that in the middle of the night that he, as generals often do, that he should get his troops together and have simulate an invasion and go up to the front. And he did. It caught us off guard. We didn't expect that. That was the only real chink that came up. Well, there was another chink probably, is the fact, of course, that later on, of course, Montgomery got caught in his tanks in Caen. He couldn't get over the hedgerows. These little things that came up. But it was not a fault of intelligence, really, particularly.
Right. What were the first reports that came in letting you know what was going on?
Oh, there were so many, it's difficult to say.
Well, give us an idea. I mean, the invasion was going well, the invasion was messed up, there was communications problems.
No, the trouble was, of course, some of these men landing, the Navy, of course, was sometimes these young men, they put their landing craft up there and they wanted to get out as fast as they could. And sometimes the soldiers were told to get out and they went down with this heavy equipment and we lost a lot of men, of course, drowned that way, you see. But it wasn't necessarily the fault of the Navy. They'd never been through anything like this before. You got a lot of people shooting at you, and lots of confusions and horrible things, But you might better ask this to people over there. You've got a lot of these people there.
We have, yes. We have. I'm just trying to get an idea of the reports that were coming back.
No, well, everything.
Okay.
The airplanes, or the flights, the bombers were great. Their paratroopers were, of course, some of them were lost along the way, trying to find their way, and landed in the wrong places. So there were areas of confusion, no question about that. No doubt about it.
I've asked this of all the veterans, including Bill Sefton and Harold Falkman and whatnot. Was there a sense that you knew we were winning, or was there a sense that we might lose?
When we landed 156,000 men that first day, we were going to win.
Okay.
But and as long as they didn't do those tanks were not going to come over there. And of course, had they come, we were pretty well prepared. We worked with the FFI, French Forces of the Interior, and our bombers would have been active, and the French were to tear up railroad lines and trucks and so forth, and to simulate any possible factors that we could to interrupt the transportation of them. There would have been some help, but basically, I think you have that number of troops ashore, you can do quite a bit with it.
Yeah.
But particularly, we had superior air force and air cover and so on.
So, pardon me. So the invasion now occurs. We clear the beach. What was from your perspective? What was the next step? I mean, once you secured the beach itself, what was the next?
The next step was entirely up to the commanders on the ground. That's entirely up to them.
Very good. You had mentioned before that on D-Day, the best you could do is just sit back and watch and hope that certain elements weren't going to interfere with the plans that were made. But as the invading force started to move through France, did your job go beyond just observing? I mean, what were you doing as they were starting to go through the hedgerows and?
We were then it became a situation of from an intelligence point of view, what is known as order of battle. We kept a very, very good order of battle, particularly division-wise, where all the Germans were and what we could do, where their strength was, where their weaknesses were, and so forth. and to see that we were cleaned out in our communication zone as we went forward, you see. And it was, and photo interpretations and all the other little nuances that make up intelligence.
See, Ralph, I think this is important to bring out.
Interrogations of prisoners of war, etc.
I think this is important to bring out because to the soldier on the ground, it seemed like there was confusion, but in actual fact, you had a pretty good picture of where they were going and where the Germans were, and so I think that's an important element to realize.
Well, of course, that's the job of intelligence, no matter at all echelons of intelligence. Right. Yes.
So beyond D-Day then, and the invasion there of France, working our way towards getting to Germany, what were the next steps in terms of your participation within the intelligence community?
Well, it was kind of interesting. I was a colonel, chief of the intelligence branch for the European Theater of Operation, United States Army, and I was in Normandy, and we decided that France was pretty well cleaned up. We said that the German general didn't really blow it up as thought they would. So I took an L5 pilot, and the two of us, I said, we're going to go into Paris. And this chap said, well, I don't have any flight maps to get into Paris. And we looked it over and said, well, here's a railroad track. That railroad track goes right into Paris. So I half navigated and half flew, and he half navigated and flew. So we landed in Paris on a football field. I don't think you take the plane off, but that was his problem, of course. But then I was met with the FFI people, French Force of the Interior, at that time, and they took me up to the most frightening drive I've ever been in. Of course, they're flying flags and being heroes, you know. And they took me to the Majestic Hotel, which had been the German headquarters, von Rundstedt's headquarters. And though I put up headquarters there for some time, most of the time I had a very permanent headquarters there, ring intelligence out of there. Then it involved a lot of different things that happened though. But then we just carried out intelligence, whether by economic, we tried to, as we would even occupy areas, we would try to get different types of warfare, warfare intelligence, so to speak, as we went along to every country, and whether it was Belgium or Holland or France, and that was it. Mm-hmm. That's the main part of the war.
In the beginning of the war, there was America was faced with so many. The British were being defeated, the Japanese were taking over all this. But I imagine now, at this point in time, there was a sense that we are moving forward. We're winning the war. There's a sense of moving forward. At what point was it that? And if there's any other stories in between here that I'm passing over, please bring them out. But at what point did it look like that we were now winning the war, and the war, at least in Europe, was coming to an end?
Well, I think we were pretty well satisfied with that. Certainly, but probably by December of that year, I think it was pretty well known we would do it. Of course, the Bulge came along later, and it was they blame intelligence for that, for not knowing about it. But Hitler was, at the one time, Hitler ordered that no communications would be transmitted for, I think it was a month or two before this, and then he was accumulating this army for the Bulge. And it caught us off guard. It caught some off guard. I'd rather not go into that because I know that some officers missed the boat on it, but some officers didn't miss the boat on it, and it's been sort of a contentious thing. But we did get caught off guard, and that was the last shot that Hitler ever had. Once he had that, he had absolutely nothing at all.
So in terms of the Battle of the Bulge, once that was over with, what were your duties after that battle was over with?
Well, just to carry on the same thing. That was about all, hoping that the war would get over sooner than it did. And of course, you must remember that while all this was coming about and having the hopes that we did, it wasn't just our armies were fighting. The Russians were closing in on them too, and we could see that the Russians were a big factor in this war, that they were coming in there, and that if they kept on the way they were going, we might be overrun ourselves by the Russians. So some people were concerned about that.
Well, that's, you know, reading the history books, of course, there was a real concern about the Russians at this point. So this was a factor then, within your decisions being made.
It was a factor, and there were some political games being played at the time. Yes, there were.
So they were our allies, but at the same time there was a certain hesitancy or concern about what they would turn out to be after they were.
Yes, they were.
Okay.
They were taking up some areas that they were not supposed to go into. We knew, but they did it anyway, looking out for themselves and looking to the future after the war. Okay. Of course, Patton always did want to go on after the Russians right at the end of the war, you know. Of course, he wasn't exactly a very silent guy. He made known his feelings pretty much.
So the European war is winding down. Was there any thought, or was there any comments made to you that you might be involved in the rest of it in terms of the defeat of Japan?
Well, yes, because we received word that some of our divisions and our troops were going to be deployed to Japan, and we were concerned about the morale of the factory. But it didn't turn out that way, of course. I myself had been ordered back to the War Department, where I was in the Executive Intelligence War Department at that time.
So what was your role there?
Well, I was doing the after-war intelligence, so to speak, to line up and to help see that the CIA got good officers, that we had intelligence officers, we could give them, and set up an organization now finally to get military intelligence where it should be. Mm-hmm. But I was anxious to get out of service, and I was constantly trying to write my own discharge to get back home. I'd had enough after all these years.
We had commented before, we talked a little bit before the interview, and I think it's important that people realize America did not have really a formal, I mean, we think of the CIA now, everybody knows who the CIA is, but at this point in time, you could talk about the state of intelligence during that very, very period of time.
Oh, it was catastrophic. We had absolutely nothing. It was no good at all. Ultimately, of course, after we were in the war, and then they set up the OSS, you see, under General Donovan. Mm-hmm. I worked closely with David Bruce, Colonel David Bruce. He'd been ambassador to Germany and Italy and Germany and France, I should say, but was well known. Fine chap, but he headed up the European OSS. I worked with him on things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So were you involved in the training of these new officers, or the building of this?
In a sense that they fell under our jurisdiction, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you were part then of
the colonel. Ironically, the colonel that headed that up was a Colonel Hamer Ford, and he was a Grand Rapids man. At least he married a Grand Rapids woman, and I know his wife and my wife were friendly during the war. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was a big responsibility because he got thousands of these officers to get replacement trained and so forth, but it was under our jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm. This may seem like a really stupid question, but what was your reaction to the end of the war, knowing that it was finally over with?
What do you think? After all these months, I've been overseas for 4 years, almost. I was delighted, of course, to get back home.
There had to be some sense of accomplishment, Ralph. I mean, you knew that certainly you were one part of this huge operation, but this is an interview about you. I just want to know personally, what did you feel in terms of at the end of the war, your part in it?
I never thought of myself as a part of it particularly. I was only one of the many, one of millions. That's all. Think of those poor guys that had to go ashore on D-Day and a lot of other things I could. So many things, but so many heroes, so many did such a great job. It's different. I had other things I I think I showed it to you before. I had this card, which is a very, very interesting card because it's one of the few cards. As a matter of fact, today they won it down in Washington, issued by General Eisenhower, given to me by Colonel Hauenstein, in which I had free access to every place and everything in the whole command, and they were not to be interfered in my duties of whatever I was doing. I still have the card. It's a very interesting card.
It is.
It's a rarity.
It is.
Yeah.
After the war, were you involved in any of the interrogation of German officers or trying to get intelligence in terms of
Yes, I not so much interrogation as a chance to meet them as they were surrendering. My principal one was General Field Marshal von Rundstedt, and I had talks with him, very interesting, as a matter of fact.
Well, you know, not many people were sitting in the same room with General Rumstead at the point where he was surrendering. So I guess, you know, here's a man who obviously believed that they were going to win, okay? What was your impression of him as a defeated leader or a defeated...
Well, yeah, he came in, he surrendered with his aide-de-camp and his a physician. And it was kind of interesting because the physician said to us, we asked one particularly favorable request for the field marshal, and also it's a medical factor. We would like to have 1 bottle of cognac per day for the field marshal. But no, von Rundstedt, we knew from intelligence that prior to the invasion, von Rundstedt wanted to give it up. He knew that we were going to be ultimate victors anyway. But Hitler, of course, that's why Hitler relieved him, put somebody else in. And I only talked to him because he'd come in and I wanted to know. I'd been in that area because I was looking for Hitler down the Berchtesgaden area, and the Redoubt area, sort of called. And I asked if he had any idea where he was, and he said no, but I should think he'd be in the mountain herding sheep. That's where he belongs, he said. So.
You know, that brings up an interesting question. Obviously, from the history books, we know what happened to Hitler, but at the point that you were at, you didn't know where he was.
We thought he was up in perhaps the Redoubt, what they call the Redoubt area. We thought he would be there, but he wasn't, of course. He was in the bunker in Berlin.
So once again, this is going to sound like a really stupid question, but tell me about the efforts to find Hitler that you know of.
Well, there were teams. All we could look for really was the Redoubt area, Berchtesgaden. We weren't in Berlin, you know. That was the Russian area. So that was about the only thing. Other people surrendered. Goering surrendered, but he was a big bull. He didn't know anything. He surrendered with his baton, of course. Which
did you meet? You actually saw him. You met him.
Yeah, I saw him. But,
what was your impression of him?
Big, fat, mouthy guy. Yeah. He thought that he was surrendering as his rank as a field marshal, big officer, and he should be treated according to his rank. Arrogant. Didn't stay arrogant very long.
You know, we know about the atrocities that the Germans were committing. I just can't imagine looking at a Goering or looking at one of these people without a certain sense of loathing. Did you have any kind, I realize as an officer and as an intelligence officer there's a certain amount of detachment, but was there any kind of within yourself, was there any kind of a personal either loathing or any kind of emotional feeling that when you saw these people and you knew what they have done?
I gained quite a bit of that feeling. I happened to be, about that time, a little before that time, I happened to be with a group we were going into, I didn't know we were going into Dachau, but it was close by, and as long as I was there, I went on the liberation of Dachau. And it was just an awful, awful thing to see. You could hardly believe it. The atrocities that the Germans had committed over there. Room, size of this room, bigger than this, just stacked with bodies, and lie in between them, and then taking them and putting them onto a slab and putting the vice, opening their mouth, pulling out their gold, and shutting them in the ovens, and a lot. I can't talk about some of them. Terrible, awful things. Yeah, because it's that nice to talk about. But it's pretty terrible, terrible, terrible things. Can't imagine. And people say, I was reading the paper the other day when a columnist said that somewhere between 20 or 30% of the Germans believe that we caused 9/11, you know, ourselves. And I thought, well, that's very understandable, because that same number exactly to believe that there was no concentration camps. That's the type of, that's the number to do it. That's the way it is.
Yeah. And winding up here, what were your duties just before you were discharged from the military? I mean, were there like cleaning up operation involved?
In the War Department, yeah, they were. You see, we had now we had to get occupational forces, so we wanted to bring back officers who'd been over there and replace them with their officers and get their command straightened out. You know, that was only a decent thing to do. There were a lot of people that had spent their entire war service in the United States. You know. And at least they could go overseas now. It wouldn't hurt you. There was a tremendous amount of political pressure. I have received calls from some important senators I know, because they had constituents that we were now going to send overseas, and they didn't like it one bit. You know. Of course, I was the wrong guy to put that on, because I didn't care.
Were you involved at all in the? I mean, you got thousands of troops and the logistics of getting them back to the States or getting back to where? Were you involved in any of that element of it?
No, not a bit.
Okay.
No. There was expertise in every area and every factor, and they had their own little problems and their own little assignments. We had ours. They did their job. We did ours. They did a wonderful job.
Yes, that's true. In the remaining moments here, are there any either anecdotal stories or any events that happen any time during this whole period that maybe we've left out, that certain things that stick out in your mind?
Yes, there are a lot of them, but we're going to keep them there.
Fair enough, Ralph. I just feel very fortunate you're sitting here right now.
Fine.
All right, so let's wrap up by, I always ask this question. I know it's a difficult question to answer. And most of the vets that I have interviewed really feel that they were just a part of a big scheme of things, and of course it was only a small part of it. But did you feel any sense of accomplishment at the end of your, as you were discharged from the military and you kind of had to look back on what you've been doing for the last number of years?
Well, I certainly did. I couldn't imagine jumping from a desk in Grand Rapids and newspapers, a city editor, to becoming a colonel, chief of an intelligence branch with the headquarters of the United States Army in Europe. It's an impossible thought, you know. It's a long step, long, unusual, and unpredictable.
Yeah.
But it's like so many, I don't know, we had how many, 12, 16 million in the war, something like that. I suppose we were all the same. And so it will always be. So it will always be. These chaps today being called out into service, they didn't expect it. But we answer the call if our country needs us. Glad to do it.
Well, we're very glad you did too, because I personally and the people in this room probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for your efforts and the efforts of the men and the women that were involved in this horrible
I don't
war.
look upon myself as being that category particularly, but glad to talk to you anyway.